In 2006, a man sat dying near the summit while more than 40 climbers walked past him. Some thought he was already gone, others knew he wasn't, and kept going anyway. He wasn't the first to die on Everest. He won't be the last. At 8,000 meters, your body is shutting down. Muscles waste, lungs drown, minds slip. It's called the death zone, and it doesn't forgive mistakes. But sometimes what happens up there isn't just about nature, it's about choices. This is the story of three men who climbed toward the same summit, but never came back. Their names were David Sharp, Green Boots, and Scott Fischer, and their bodies are. And what happened to them will change the way you see Everest forever. David Sharp wasn't reckless. He was just alone. In 2006, he set out to climb Everest without a team. No Sherpas, no bottled oxygen, no backup plan, just a belief that he could do it the pure way. In 2006, Sharp chose the cheapest expedition available, a budget climb on the north side. No weather support, no satellite comms, no backup plan. On May 13th, he set off for the summit. Sometime during the night, he may have reached the top. Some climbers later reported seeing a lone figure sitting near the summit that matched his gear. But by morning, he wasn't climbing anymore. At 8,500 meters, just below the summit, David Sharp was found curled inside a shallow limestone alcove known as Green Boots Cave, named after another dead climber whose body had marked the route for years. Sharp was lying next to it, curled up, motionless. His limbs were frozen, his face covered, oxygen mask empty. But he was alive. Climbers began passing him as early as dawn. Some thought he was already dead. Some stopped and listened. They heard groaning. A few tried to help, but no one stayed. Most assumed he was beyond saving. Some didn't want to believe he was still alive. Others simply didn't have the means to help. Not in the death zone, where every extra step feels like dragging an anchor. A Turkish team saw him. They couldn't assist. Members of a large commercial expedition noticed him too. One Sherpa stopped and checked. Sharp whispered his name. He asked to sleep, but sleep at that altitude is a final surrender. One climber radioed down. Some teams argued about what to do, but no one stayed, and no rescue ever came. That day, over 40 climbers, 40, passed David Sharp. Let that sink in. By the next morning, David Sharp was dead. His body remained in Green Boots Cave for nearly a year before Sherpas moved it onto a ledge and let it fall over the north face, a final act of dignity in a place that had shown him none. The outrage was immediate. How could so many climbers walk past a dying man? Why didn't anyone give him oxygen, try to carry him, do something? The answers are brutal. At 8,500 meters, most climbers can barely help themselves. Attempting a rescue can mean death. Few are trained. Radios fail. And David? He was alone. No one knew he was missing. No one was watching. He gambled on Everest's silence and lost. And just meters from where David Sharp took his last breath, another climber had already been lying there for a decade, a silent witness to every ascent, known not by name, but by what he wore. A few meters below Everest's main northeast ridge sits a small limestone cave, known infamously among climbers as Green Boots Cave. For years, ascending teams passed by without slowing, seeing only a curled figure on its side. Bright green plastic Koflak boots stuck out from the snow, and that was all you needed to recognize him. He became simply known as Green Boots. His real name was likely Tsewang Paljor, a head constable from Ladakh, India, born in 1968. He joined the Indo-Tibetan Border Police to serve and to climb. On May 10, 1996, Paljor, Dorje Morup, and Sewang Samanla broke away near 3:45 p.m. to push for the summit. They radioed they'd made it, but later analysis suggests they may have only reached a false peak, still about 150 meters short. A blizzard soon struck, with winds over 100 kilometers per hour and temperatures plunging below -40 degrees Celsius. None of the three returned. Later that season, climbers discovered a frozen body beneath the rock overhang at about 8,500 meters. He lay on his left side, knees tucked and arms folded. His face was obscured by ice. Gear and oxygen bottles lay nearby, and the neon green boots were unmistakable. Green boots became a fixed waypoint for climbers, a warning, a grim measurement of how close they were to the summit, or how real the risk was beneath their feet. In 2006, when David Sharp died in that very cave, many ascending climbers assumed he was Green Boots, already frozen in death. They bypassed him, expecting nothing more could be done. For over 2 decades, Green Boots lay frozen beneath a narrow ledge, an accidental milestone on the way to the summit. But not all who died on Everest were nameless. Some were legends, leaders, guides trusted with other people's lives. Scott Fischer was one of them, and in 1996, his strength finally ran out. Scott Fischer wasn't supposed to die on Everest. He was one of the best, a legend. At 40 years old, he'd already summited Everest without oxygen, a feat that earned him global respect. He was tough, charismatic, and known for his mantra: "You've got to get up, get down, and get out." But Everest doesn't care about credentials. Scott was the founder of Mountain Madness, one of the premier guiding companies on the mountain. His 1996 expedition was packed with clients, guides, Sherpas, and pressure. Because when you're the face of a business, failure isn't just personal, it's professional. On May 10th, 1996, Scott began his final summit push from Camp 4 near the South Col at 7,900 meters. It started with blue skies, high hopes, but everything moved slower than planned. Bottlenecks near the Hillary Step, delays fixing ropes, altitude fatigue, and clients falling behind. Scott was struggling too. He was ill, possibly with HAPE, high-altitude pulmonary edema. His speech was slurred. He moved slowly. Even with supplemental oxygen, he couldn't maintain his pace. But he kept pushing. At 3:45 p.m., nearly 2 hours past the safe turnaround time, Scott Fischer reached the summit. He stayed for just 20 minutes before beginning his descent. But something was wrong. He was stumbling, falling behind. Lobsang Jongbu, Mountain Madness's lead Sherpa, tried to help. He short-roped Scott down, practically dragging him along. But by the time they reached the south summit, Scott collapsed. Oxygen was nearly gone. The cold was penetrating even the thickest gear. And Scott, barely conscious, told Lobsang to go down and get help. That was the last order he ever gave. Later that night, Anatoly Bukreev, a guide from Scott's own team, made a heroic solo rescue mission, saving multiple stranded climbers in hurricane-force winds. But he couldn't save Scott. When Bukreev finally reached him, Fischer was barely alive. His oxygen mask was empty. His hands were exposed. His down suit was unzipped, one arm sticking out of the fabric, a textbook sign of paradoxical undressing, a symptom of terminal hypothermia. Scott Fischer was dying, not from a single mistake, but from an accumulation of them: the altitude, the delays, the exhaustion. Bukreev stayed with him as long as he could. Then he moved Fischer's body off the main climbing route, covered his face with snow, and left him there, on the side of the mountain he'd once conquered. To this day, his body remains there, frozen into the slope. Scott Fischer wasn't a victim of bad luck. He was a victim of Everest's razor-thin margins, of trying to lead others up a peak that takes everything from everyone. He was one of the strongest, one of the boldest, and even he couldn't beat it. Because on Everest, strength can carry you up, but it doesn't always bring you back down. David Sharp, Green Boots, Scott Fischer, 3 climbers, 3 bodies, 3 truths. Everest didn't just take their lives, it took their choices, their dreams, their limits, and left them frozen in time. Because on the world's highest peak, the air is thin, but the cost is heavy, and the mountain never forgets. Everest's dead are easy to turn into symbols, warnings frozen in place, landmarks on the way to someone else's dream, but the mountain didn't stop claiming lives when David Sharp, green boots, and Scott Fischer fell silent. It just got busier. More permits, more companies, more people standing in the same thin air, believing they'd be different. Fast forward to a modern Everest, where the death zone isn't just a place, it's a queue. And in that line stood a man named Don Cash. You're standing in line, but this isn't a theme park or a concert. This is a line on Mount Everest. You're in the death zone, 8,000 meters above sea level and waiting for your turn at the Hillary Step, a jagged ledge barely wide enough for one person. And up here, every second costs you oxygen, warmth, and life. Just ahead, someone has stopped moving. At first you think he's just resting, but then you notice the way his head slumps, the stillness, and the boots buried in snow. What you see is not a living climber, it's a warning. Today we start with the story of Don Cash, a father, a dreamer, a man who reached the top of the world and never came back. He didn't fall, he wasn't swept off by an avalanche. He died standing still, frozen in time, waiting in a line. Everest didn't kill him with storms or rock slides, it killed him with silence. Before we go further, I would like to tell you, this channel is small but growing. If you find stories like this meaningful like me, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps me more than you know. Thank you. Don Cash wasn't your typical mountaineer. He was 55, a software sales executive from Utah, a family man with a quiet obsession, the 7 summits. He wasn't in it for fame. He didn't want records. He wanted to finish something that only a few thousand humans have ever done, climb the tallest mountain on every continent. He'd already bagged mountains like Kilimanjaro, Aconcagua, Denali, and Vinson. Just one mountain remained, Everest. In 2019, Don signed on with a Nepali guiding company called Pioneer Adventure. It wasn't one of the big Western operators, but it was more affordable. He trained and he prepared, and in May, during Everest's short summit window, he made his push. His family supported him, though they worried. Everest is never guaranteed, especially not for someone in their mid-50s. But Don was calm, he stayed focused and determined. On May 22, 2019, just after sunrise, Don reached the summit of Everest. He stood at 8,848 meters, the highest point on Earth. He called his family on a satellite phone and left a message. I feel so blessed. He had made it. The 7 summits were complete. The dream was done. Except, on Everest, climbers know that summiting is only half the story. More than 80% of deaths on the mountain happen during the descent. Because your oxygen is low, your body is shutting down, your mind is foggy, and you still have hours to go, down steep ice, across knife-edged ridges, and through the very place you just barely survived. Don's descent took him to the Hillary Step, a vertical rock face just below the summit. In 2015, it partially collapsed during the Nepal earthquake, making it even more dangerous. Climbers now relied on fixed ropes to scramble up and down the route. And in 2019, more than 200 climbers had chosen that same day to summit. A traffic jam formed at 28,000 feet. He wasn't the only one in trouble that day. As Don waited at the bottleneck, other climbers were also starting to fail. Some ran out of bottled oxygen, others lost consciousness. It became a slow-motion collapse, scattered along the trail. But unlike Don, many had the strength to keep moving, or enough luck to be noticed in time. Don didn't yell for help. He didn't panic. He simply slipped further and further into the fog of altitude sickness until he couldn't fight back. That's how the mountain takes you, slowly, quietly, without drama. That morning, an image went viral, a single line of climbers stretching from the summit down to the step. Bodies stacked on a ridge no wider than a table. People standing in line in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Some ran out of oxygen, some collapsed, and some never made it down. Don Cash was in that line. Just below the step, Don collapsed. His Sherpas tried to help. They gave him oxygen and performed CPR. He briefly woke up, thanked them, then collapsed again. He was exhausted, disoriented, The altitude was winning. The cold was sinking in, and the line wasn't moving. The Sherpas tried to drag him down, but Everest has no mercy for heroics. At that altitude, carrying another person is nearly impossible. Your muscles are weak, your lungs are on fire. Even helping someone for too long can mean death. Eventually, they had to stop. Other climbers passed. Some didn't know what was happening. Others were simply too far gone to help. In the death zone, survival comes first. It has to. That's not selfish. That's the rule of Everest. Don never made it back to Camp 4. His body now rests just below the step, still dressed in his down suit, his boots half covered in snow. For a while, climbers used him as a landmark. Turn left after dawn. A quiet man, now frozen in place, a part of the mountain. But Don's story didn't end there. His death sparked outrage. News outlets blamed overcrowding. Permits were being handed out to too many companies. Too many inexperienced climbers and not enough safety regulations. Everest, once a sacred challenge, had become a circus. That day, May 22, 2019, 11 people died on Everest. Not all from falls or storms. Many, like Don, died of exhaustion, from delays, from waiting. For a brief moment, Everest was headline news. Don's story was printed in the New York Times, BBC, CNN, and dozens of global outlets. People were shocked. How could someone die in a line? It was supposed to be a mountain, not a traffic jam. But for veteran climbers, it wasn't shocking at all. Everest had been inching toward this reality for years. Too many people, too few guides, too many shortcuts. And Don's death was the consequence. A good man in over his head. Not from inexperience, but from the chaos around him. His family mourned. His daughter said, "If your goals don't scare you, they're not big enough." His wife, Monette, later told reporters, "He died doing what he loved. That's not a tragedy." But even she admitted, Everest had become too crowded, too commercial, too deadly. There's something deeply human about Don's story. He wasn't chasing fame. He wasn't reckless. He just wanted to finish something he started. He believed in himself, trusted his team, and gave everything to the mountain. That kind of quiet dedication is rare. It's easy to judge from the outside, but in truth, Don was just like the rest of us. Someone trying to turn a lifelong dream into a moment of glory. And that dream, no matter how pure, collided with a system that no longer had room for mistakes. There's something uniquely chilling about Don's death. He didn't perish in a dramatic fall. He didn't vanish in a storm. He died standing in line. It was the most ordinary death, in the most extraordinary place. That's what makes it so terrifying, because anyone could be next. Climbers say it's not the altitude that kills you, it's the waiting. Every minute you spend above 8,000 meters, your body is dying. Everest gives you a window, and if you miss it, it closes fast. Don's body didn't give out because he was unprepared. It gave out because the system around him was broken. Even Nirmal Purja, who summited that same day, said the traffic jam put everyone at risk. His famous photo of the human traffic line is now burned into the minds of mountaineers. Everest, it seems, has become a place where dreams die not with drama, but with delay. Don's death reignited the debate. Should Everest have a climber cap? Should companies be required to vet their clients? Should rescue efforts be mandatory, no matter the cost? But Everest answers none of those questions. It just takes, and keeps taking. Today, Don's body remains on the mountain. His family has requested it stays there, not out of carelessness, but out of love, because that was his dream, to stand on the roof of the world. And he did. The line didn't end with Don. It just kept inching forward. Same ridge, same ropes, same cold arithmetic. A few days later, another quiet climber stepped into that system of delays and thin margins. His name was Christopher John Kulish, and his finish line would be drawn in the same season that took Don. This is the story of Christopher John Kulish, a family man, a lawyer, a dreamer, a man who reached the top of the world and never came back. He didn't fall, he wasn't swept off by an avalanche. He died standing still, frozen in time, waiting in a line. Everest didn't kill him with storms or rock slides, it killed him with silence. Chris wasn't your typical headline chaser. He was 62, a Colorado attorney from Boulder, a careful climber with a quiet obsession: the 7 summits. He wasn't in it for records. He didn't want attention. He wanted to finish something that only a few thousand humans have ever done: climb the tallest mountain on every continent. He'd already stood on peaks like Kilimanjaro, Aconcagua, Denali, and Vinson. Just one mountain remained: Everest. In 2019, Chris joined a Nepali-led team for Everest's short window. He trained and he prepared, and in late May, as the jet stream shifted just enough to open the route, he made his push. His family supported him, and like any family, they worried. Everest is never guaranteed, especially not in a season packed with crowds. But Chris was calm, focused, and determined. On May 27, 2019, just after sunrise, Chris reached the summit of Everest. He stood at 8,848 meters, the highest point on Earth. The 7 summits were complete. The dream was done. Except, on Everest, climbers know that summiting is only half the story. Most deaths on the mountain happen during the descent. Because your oxygen is low, your body is shutting down, your mind is foggy, and you still have hours to go. Down steep ice, across knife-edged ridges, and through the very place you just barely survived. That season's descent led back toward the Hillary Step. Years earlier, the 2015 Nepal earthquake had changed that section, leaving climbers to rely even more on fixed lines. In 2019, a tight weather window funneled teams onto the same days. The result was predictable: bottlenecks on a ridge that wasn't built for waiting. A traffic jam formed at 28,000 feet. He wasn't the only one facing risk that week. As climbers stacked up near the choke points, others began to fade. Some ran low on bottled oxygen, others drifted in and out. It became a slow-motion collapse, scattered along the route. But unlike some, Chris moved through, tagged the top, and started down. That's the trap. The line doesn't need to take you right there. It can steal minutes you can't earn back and collect the debt later. That week, an image went viral: a single line of climbers stretching from the summit down to the step. Bodies stacked on a ridge no wider than a table. People standing in line in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Some ran out of oxygen, some collapsed, and some never made it down. Here's what most people miss. Chris summited a few days after the most circulated photo of that line. Different morning, same pressure cooker dynamics. A narrow window. Crowds stacking at critical obstacles. Minutes vanishing in thin air. The picture became a symbol for the season, not a timestamp on every single tragedy. Chris climbed through that same world of delays. Maybe not in that exact frame, but in that same slow grind where time and cold eat at your margin. He reached the top anyway, because that's what committed climbers do. Then he turned around to pay the bill. Back at the South Col, Camp 4, the last fragile shelf before the drop to lower camps, Chris collapsed. Teammates and Sherpa guides tried to help. They gave him oxygen. They worked to revive him. For a moment there was hope, and then there wasn't. The altitude was winning. The cold was sinking in. And the mountain doesn't pause for anyone. Rescue above 8,000 meters is almost impossible. Your muscles are weak. Your lungs are burning. Even helping for too long can mean death. People do what they can, but at that height, physics and biology are not on your side. Other climbers passed, some unaware, others barely holding it together themselves. In the death zone, survival comes first. It has to. That isn't selfish. That's the rule of Everest. Chris never made it beyond Camp 4. His team and family brought the news home. Friends remembered a measured man who finished what he started, a quiet life that ended on the world's loudest mountain without a sound. But his story didn't end there. His death helped focus a storm that had been building for years. News outlets blamed overcrowding. Permits were being handed out to too many teams, too many clients, and not enough margin. Everest, once a sacred challenge, looked more like a queue. That spring, multiple climbers died on Everest, not all from falls or storms. Many were worn down by exposure, delay, and the thin math of time and oxygen. Waiting became its own hazard. Camp 4 itself explains why. The South Col is a wind-scoured saddle where the air holds only a fraction of the oxygen your body expects. Even resting, your heart races. Tiny problems, dehydration, a leaky mask, a missed snack, grow fast in that environment. You don't have much room to fix anything once it starts going wrong. That's why climbers live by turnaround times. If a jam near the top pushes you past your cutoff, every extra minute is borrowed from the oxygen you'll need later. You can be smiling on the summit and already be in the red, committed to a descent with less air, less heat, and fewer options. Passing on fixed lines is technically possible but risky. To overtake, you have to unclip and reclip around other climbers on steep terrain when your hands are numb and your brain is slow. Most people won't attempt it when they're depleted, so the queue holds and the clock turns. And Sherpa strength, as heroic as it is, can't break physics. They fix ropes, ferry loads, and still try to help when things go sideways. But at that altitude, even rescuers are running near empty. The brutal truth is that aid above the South Col is limited by the same thin air that's hurting the person who needs it. For a brief moment, Everest was headline news. People were shocked. How could someone die in a line? It was supposed to be a mountain, not a traffic jam. But to veteran climbers, it wasn't shocking at all. Everest had been inching toward this for years. More people, tighter windows, slimmer margins. Chris's death was part of that pattern, not because he passed away in the line, but because the line reshaped everything around him. His family mourned. Those who knew him took comfort in the fact that he reached his goal. They also admitted a hard truth. When a mountain gets this crowded, the cost of a small delay multiplies for everyone. There's something deeply human about Chris's story. He wasn't chasing fame. He wasn't reckless. He just wanted to finish something he started. He believed in himself, trusted his partners, and gave everything to the mountain. That kind of steady dedication is rare. It's easy to judge from the outside, but in truth, Chris was like many of us. Someone trying to turn a lifelong promise into a moment of completion. And that promise collided with a system that no longer had room for mistakes. There's something uniquely chilling about his death. He didn't perish in a dramatic fall. He didn't vanish in a storm. He reached the top, came down to the high camp, and the lights went out. An ordinary end, in an extraordinary place. That's what makes it so unsettling, because anyone could think they're fine, until the mountain quietly says otherwise. Climbers say it's not just the altitude that gets you, it's the waiting. Every minute above 8,000 meters, your body is running on credit. Everest gives you a window, and if you spend too long in the red, it closes fast. Chris didn't fail because he was unprepared. He was caught in a season where time itself turned risky. Even the photo that defined that spring, the human traffic line near the top, tells the story. Not of drama, but delay. A place where dreams don't always end with a stumble. They fade with stillness. Chris's death reignited the debate. Should Everest have a climber cap? Should companies vet clients more strictly? Should there be tougher rules for timing and rescue? The mountain answers none of those questions. It just takes, and keeps taking. His family remembers him for a life well lived, a goal completed, and a final sunrise above the world. That's not nothing. That's everything he worked for. To see how long this pattern has been building, you have to rewind, not to another headline, but to another man who measured risk in careful steps. 2 years earlier, in 2017, Dr. Roland Yearwood returned to the mountain that had already spared him once. Different week, different weather, same truth. He survived Everest's deadliest day and went back. Hours into the death zone, near a narrow perch called the balcony, everything changed. What happened to Dr. Roland Yearwood up there wasn't simple, and it wasn't just weather. In the end, he was found near the balcony. The story points to hypoxia and exposure more than any single misstep. To understand the ending, we have to see where the obsession began. He wasn't a thrill-chasing influencer. He was a small-town doctor who stitched cuts, calmed panic, and drove home under the same streetlights as everyone else. In 2015, He stood at Everest Base Camp when the earth groaned, snow broke loose, and chaos rolled through the tents. He lived, many didn't. Back in Alabama, people called him lucky. He didn't talk about luck. He talked about unfinished business. Roland Yearwood trained quietly. Long shifts, longer runs. He studied the route like a surgeon studies scans, camp by camp, hazard by hazard, oxygen plans and backup plans. Friends saw the steady grin, the matter-of-fact tone. No bravado, no chest thumping. Just a promise tucked into everyday life. One more try. The mountain had changed since the quake, and so had he. Surviving base camp sharpened something. Respect, caution, maybe resolve. He wasn't chasing a selfie at the summit. He was chasing a clean line through risk, the kind of problem a careful mind can't stop solving. That mindset carried him back to Nepal in 2017, into a season packed with permits, thin weather windows, and a route every climber swore felt a little different near the top. He knew the odds. He went anyway. Because for some people, the horizon isn't a wall, it's a dare. But that wasn't the whole story. The crowding and timing of that year added a new pressure Roland couldn't control. 2017 wasn't generous. Forecasts kept shrinking the safe window, and hundreds of climbers aimed for the same narrow slice of sky. When a jet stream eases for a day or two, everyone moves at once. That means headlamps in a line, fresh snow kicked into thin air, and every delay magnified at altitude. You don't just wait, you burn time, heat, and oxygen. Permits were high, pressure higher. Teams watched each other like chess players. Leave too early and you fight wind. Leave too late and you join a queue above 8,000 meters where minutes feel like theft. Up there, a pause isn't a pause. It's a drain on the bottle strapped to your mask and a test of whatever reserves you have left. Reports from that season kept warning about fickle gusts and bottlenecks. Even tiny holdups at anchors could stretch into dangerous standstills. And near the top, the route itself had a new mood after the quake. Small changes that only matter when your tank, legs, and brain are all on the edge. Roland knew the math. He wasn't chasing other climbers. He was chasing daylight, calm air, and a clean margin on oxygen. The plan was simple on paper. Move smooth, avoid the clogs, keep the mask flowing, don't linger. But simple plans don't always survive the death zone, and the stretch they call the balcony would make that brutally clear. They left the South Col in the dark, a quiet river of headlamps sliding toward the ridge. The air up there doesn't negotiate. Every step taxes the mind first, then the legs. The route tilts past the triangle face and onto a narrow stance called the balcony, an exposed ledge where climbers swap bottles, check masks, and catch a thin breath that never feels like enough. Roland moved the way he worked back home, steady, methodical, no drama. He knew this stretch, old snow, patches of blue ice, fixed lines that groan when the wind tugs. Above, the ridge steepens toward the south summit. Below, the South Col looks like a faraway landing strip. The balcony is where plans meet reality. It's also where delays multiply. One stuck ascender can stack a dozen people in the cold. Some accounts later put him near that ledge when things turned. Not a misstep, not a scene, just the kind of slow fade the altitude is famous for. Up there, small problems get loud. A hose icing, a regulator misbehaving, a mask seal that isn't perfect. Minutes slip, heat drains, decision-making narrows to the single choice in front of you. Radios crackled, teams were stretched, other incidents were unfolding higher on the ridge, and information felt off by half an hour at best. What's clear is this. As the night pressed on near the balcony, Roland's margin thinned. Whether he was pushing upward or trying to turn, the mountain started asking for more than a human body could pay. But that wasn't the whole story. The confusion that followed would twist the narrative even further. By sunrise, headlines were already racing him down the mountain. Some said he fell near the top. Others said he was found lower, near that narrow perch. Early numbers bounced, details shifted, and a rumor about multiple bodies in a high camp tent flared, then fizzled when veterans pushed back. That's Everest on a busy window. Scattered radios, delayed call-ins, dying batteries, and teams spread across a ridge where every voice sounds like wind. Rescuers were juggling more than one emergency. Another climber was missing on the descent. A second was in trouble after a push in thin air. Helicopters can't just pluck people off the ridge. On-foot teams grind upward, step by step, with the clock eating into their own safety margins. In that noise, even simple facts wobble. So, the narrative twisted. Near the summit, near the balcony, on the way up, on the way down. What held steady was the setting. The death zone, where your margin is smaller than you think and shrinking faster than you feel. Strip away the contradictions and a single pattern remains. Amid those mixed reports, one fact endures. He was found near the balcony, most consistent with a slow failure from hypoxia and exposure, not a fall. At that altitude, the mountain doesn't have to throw a storm to win. It can take you quietly, and what likely happened next explains why even strong climbers lose that fight. Up there, the body runs on debt. Oxygen drops, thinking blurs, and warmth leaks out faster than you can make it. Even with a mask, everything depends on tiny details: flow rate, a clean seal, a bottle that isn't running low. If any of that slips, you don't crash. You fade. First it's pace, then judgment, then the strength to turn around. The balcony is where many climbers try to switch bottles. That sounds simple at sea level. At 8,000 plus, fingers go dumb, clips snag, and minutes stretch. A regulator that hisses the wrong way, a hose that ices, a mask that fogs, each one steals heat and time. Add a cue and you're standing still while altitude keeps climbing inside you. High altitude illness doesn't shout, it whispers. A headache that feels ordinary, a cough that won't clear, a step that used to feel easy now feels glued. Some people get fluid where it shouldn't be. Others drift into a fog and don't notice they're drifting. The cruel part is how normal it can seem right before it isn't. That morning, the simplest explanation fits the harshest facts. Exposure in brutal cold, thin air winning a slow fight, and a margin that vanished before help could matter. He was found near the balcony, and the evidence points to altitude-related complications, rather than a fall. Not a single big mistake, a series of small human moments that added up in the one place that punishes them all. But he wasn't the only one paying for that window, and what unfolded around him would make the picture even harder to read. He wasn't alone in that thin, dangerous slice of time. Another climber vanished after summiting and never made it back to camp. A second collapsed on the descent. A third pushed into air so lean it turns minutes into miles and paid for it before help could catch up. Same window, same ridge, different teams, all feeling the squeeze of cold, wind, and cues that move too slow. Confusion multiplied the risk. Radio handoffs missed details. Summit times didn't line up. A sensational claim about bodies in a high camp tent flashed across headlines, then got walked back when veterans on the ground said the numbers were wrong. That's how it goes on Everest when the window is crowded. Facts lag reality, and stories harden before the truth has oxygen. Whispers added fuel. Some climbers talked about missing oxygen at high camps, gear shifting hands, and bottles not where they were stashed. Maybe it was mix-ups, maybe it was worse. Either way, a missing cylinder at 8,000 meters isn't an inconvenience. It's a countdown. Thread those pieces together, and the weekend looks like a pressure cooker. Too many people in too little weather, small problems stacking into big ones, and rescue stretched thin across a mountain that doesn't bend. Roland's fate was part of that pattern, not an isolated headline. Pull back from the chaos, and a harder question comes into focus, the one that follows every tragedy on Everest. Why do people still go, knowing exactly how this story can end? Back home, Roland wasn't a headline. He was the doctor who lingered in doorways to make sure a patient's breathing settled before he left. Church potlucks, small-town ball games, late-night calls from worried families. He showed up. That steadiness is what he carried to the Himalaya. The belief that careful work, done one step at a time, can fix hard problems. Everest is the one place where that faith meets a ceiling. You can be prepared, humble, disciplined, and still run out of air or luck. Roll the clock back further, to a season that turned the north side into a corridor of fatigue and hard choices. Long before viral summit lines, Thomas Weber climbed toward the roof of the world, with vision that faded as the air thinned. What happened next would show how ambition narrows to a razor's edge when the mountain starts taking more than it gives. He was just 50 meters from the top of the world when everything went dark. Exhausted, blind, and staggering in the death zone of Everest, Thomas Weber's final climb turned into one of the mountain's most haunting tragedies. Weber wasn't the strongest climber on the mountain, and he wasn't there to break records. He was a man who had already survived a brain tumor, left with vision that failed him at high altitude, and he was determined to prove that his condition wouldn't stop him from standing on the roof of the world. But Everest has a way of stripping climbers bare, and what happened to Weber that day exposed the razor-thin line between ambition and survival. Thomas Weber's story wasn't like most who set their sights on Everest. Years earlier, he had undergone surgery to remove a brain tumor, a battle that left him partially blind. At sea level, he could manage, but in the thin air of high altitude, his vision would blur until he was effectively climbing in darkness. For Weber, reaching Everest wasn't about chasing glory. It was about proving that his limitations didn't define him. Friends described him as determined, even stubborn, with a drive that sometimes pushed him beyond reason. And that drive would take him to a place few climbers ever dare to go. But climbing Everest isn't just about personal willpower. It's about survival in an environment where even the smallest mistake can be fatal. And as Weber prepared for his final summit push in May 2006, the mountain was about to test his limits in ways no one could have imagined. By late May of 2006, the Everest season was already notorious. Storms, bottlenecks, and a string of tragedies had turned the world's highest mountain into a graveyard in the clouds. Yet for Thomas Weber, this was the moment he had been waiting for. At 8,000 meters, climbers enter what's called the death zone, where the human body slowly shuts down with every breath. For Weber, whose eyesight was already compromised, the risks were multiplied. Guided by Harry Keekstra, a well-known climber, Weber pushed higher into the thinning air. At first, he seemed strong enough, moving slowly but steadily, but the higher he went, the more his vision began to fade. By the time he reached above 8,600 meters, he was effectively blind. Every step became a gamble, every foothold a matter of trust in his guide's voice. Witnesses later recalled how he stumbled, unsteady and disoriented, his balance faltering as if the mountain itself was pulling him off course. Still, Weber pressed on. His ambition was locked on the summit, just a few hundred meters above. But ambition doesn't hold much weight in the death zone. The air was too thin, his body too drained, and soon his fight against the mountain was slipping out of his control. And what happened next would be the moment where everything turned. At around 8,750 meters, Weber was less than 50 meters from the top. To most climbers, that final stretch is a lifetime dream within reach, but for him, it became an impossible wall. His strength had drained away, his steps slowed to a crawl, and then, with no warning, he stopped. Harry Keekstra tried to guide him, urging him to keep moving, but Weber's body wasn't responding. He staggered in place, unable to find balance, his blindness leaving him completely dependent on the voices around him. Climbers nearby described him as totally exhausted, a man running on nothing but determination. At that altitude, determination is rarely enough. Finally, Keekstra made the call. They had to turn back. The summit would remain untouched, but even the descent became a desperate struggle. Weber collapsed into the snow, his breathing shallow, whispering the words, "I am dying." Moments later, his body gave out. In the thin air of Everest's death zone, there are no second chances. His guide tried to pull him up, but Weber's strength had vanished. And then, in one of the most chilling moments reported on Everest, he slipped away completely, his climb ending just below the top of the world. But the tragedy wasn't just his alone. It came during one of Everest's deadliest seasons, a time that would raise disturbing questions about why so many were dying on the mountain. Thomas Weber's death didn't happen in isolation. The spring of 2006 became one of the most infamous seasons in Everest history. Over 40 climbers would lose their lives that year, many of them on the very same north side route where Weber collapsed. The mountain had turned into a corridor of suffering, where climbers stepped past bodies frozen in the snow, each one a warning that few could afford to heed. It was a season that exposed the brutal reality of Everest's commercialization. Hundreds of climbers, some experienced, others dangerously unprepared, crowded into the death zone, each chasing their personal dream. Guides were overwhelmed, oxygen supplies stretched thin, and rescue efforts were nearly impossible above 8,000 meters. In that chaos, climbers like Weber faced an unforgiving truth. Once you falter up there, very few can save you. What made Weber's case even more haunting was how vulnerable he already was. Blindness in the death zone meant he was climbing on trust alone, every step depending on others. Yet, Everest isn't a place where teamwork always holds. Up there, survival narrows to the individual. Climbers who pass a fallen man often aren't heartless. They're simply powerless. To stop is to risk their own life. And in 2006, that deadly calculation played out over and over again. Weber's fall into the snow wasn't just one man's tragedy. It became a symbol of how far climbers were willing to push themselves, even when the mountain had already made it clear who would and would not survive. But the question remained, why did it go so wrong for him in particular? Looking back at Thomas Weber's final hours, it's clear his tragedy wasn't caused by a single mistake. It was a chain of risks that all collided in the death zone. The first and most obvious was his health. Years earlier, the surgery that saved his life also cost him his vision. At lower altitudes, Weber could manage. But on Everest, where oxygen levels dropped to 1/3 of what's available at sea level, his sight faded to nothing. By the time he reached the summit ridge, he was completely blind. Climbing blind at 8,700 meters isn't just dangerous, it's nearly impossible. The second factor was exhaustion. Climbers in the death zone burn through their strength faster than they realize. Even the healthiest athletes can collapse if they push too hard, and Weber's body was already fighting an uphill battle. Witnesses described him as staggering, unable to find balance and leaning heavily on his guide for every step. At that point, his body wasn't climbing anymore. It was simply breaking down. Then came the altitude sickness. Above 8,000 meters, the lack of oxygen doesn't just weaken the muscles, it clouds the mind. Climbers make poor decisions, lose focus, and sometimes slip into delirium. For Weber, who was already disoriented without vision, the effects of altitude were magnified. He wasn't just fighting Everest, he was fighting his own body shutting down. Together, these factors created the perfect storm. Blindness, exhaustion, and altitude sickness combined in a place where no mistakes are forgiven. When Weber whispered his final words, "I am dying," it wasn't drama. It was the raw truth of what happens when human determination collides with the limits of survival. But his death also forced the climbing world to ask a much bigger question. Was Everest itself changing, or were the climbers who came to it unprepared for what they faced? Thomas Weber's death became part of a larger conversation about the way Everest was being climbed. By 2006, the mountain wasn't just a test for elite mountaineers, it had become a business. Commercial expeditions promised to take clients to the summit for a price, often filling the routes with people who had little high-altitude experience. Sherpas and guides carried the heaviest loads, set the ropes, and risked their lives, while climbers with deep pockets chased a dream that sometimes turned fatal. Weber's case raised difficult questions. Should a man with failing eyesight have been allowed to attempt Everest at all? Was it an act of courage, or a dangerous gamble encouraged by the very industry that profited from it? His death forced people to confront the thin line between determination and recklessness. And it wasn't just about Weber. His story reflected a larger truth about the mountain itself. Everest is often called the ultimate adventure, but at its core, it's also a place where ambition collides with survival. Every season, climbers step past frozen bodies, reminders of those who thought they could beat the mountain. Guides like Harry Kikstra argued that they did everything possible for Weber, but Everest doesn't bend to effort or good intentions. It remains an unrelenting judge of human limits. For many, Weber's story became a warning, proof that Everest doesn't forgive weakness and that the mountain doesn't care about your reasons for being there. Blindness, determination, or the dream of proving something to yourself. None of it matters if the mountain decides otherwise. But Weber's tragedy also leaves us with one last haunting question. What drives people to keep risking everything for a chance at the summit? Thomas Weber's climb ended just steps away from glory, but it's the way he died, blind, exhausted, and whispering his final words, that makes his story unforgettable. His death wasn't just a single tragedy on a mountain full of them. It was a reminder of what Everest really is. For some, it's the ultimate test of endurance. For others, it's a dangerous business where ambition is sold at the cost of human life. And still, the questions didn't fade. They followed every expedition right into the present. In 2025, those questions hardened into a choice near the very top of the world, where a Sherpa guide stared at a client who wouldn't move, and the mountain asked for an answer no one wants to give. Most climbers who die on Everest never see it coming, but this time, someone had to make the call, leave a man behind to die, or perhaps die trying to save him. It was May the 15th, 2025. Subrata Ghosh had just reached the summit of Mount Everest, his dream fulfilled. But on the way down, everything unraveled. He was moving slower than anyone expected, and by the time he reached the Hillary Step, he could barely speak. Sherpa Palshen Tamang, his high-altitude guide, stayed close. Subrata wasn't injured, he wasn't unconscious, but he simply refused to keep moving. Oxygen was running out, and the temperature was dropping fast. Tamang knew the signs: frostbitten hands, pale skin, disoriented muttering. Subrata was in trouble, but he also wasn't listening. Most people assume dying on Everest is violent or sudden, a fall, a storm, an avalanche. But the truth is far quieter. It's just stopping, sitting down, letting go, and Subrata had stopped. Palchen Tamang had guided climbers through Everest's most treacherous zones for years, but something about this moment felt heavier, more fragile. Subrata Ghosh wasn't panicking or crying for help. He wasn't even pleading for rest. He was just still. It was the kind of stillness that terrifies seasoned climbers. The blank stare, the slow blink, the silence. Subrata's body language was saying what his mouth couldn't. He wasn't coming down. He was shutting down. And Tamang knew it. He'd seen it before, when the cold seeps into the brain and convinces people that lying down in the snow is safer than taking one more step. It's called hypoxia-induced apathy. Oxygen deprivation messes with judgment. It convinces climbers they're warm when they're freezing, strong when they're dying, and safe when they're not. Tamang pleaded with him. He offered to carry his gear. He even unclipped his own oxygen to share it. Nothing worked. Subrata just muttered something under his breath, maybe in Bengali, maybe nonsense, and kept sitting. But here's the cruel reality of the death zone. It doesn't give you time to argue. The air is so thin that every minute you linger takes days off your life. Muscles stop responding, fingers turn black, vision blurs. And for Tamang, who was also running low on oxygen, the decision became less about saving Subrata and more about surviving himself. The wind was picking up. Clouds were rolling in. Radios crackled with reports of another climber going missing nearby. And still, Subrata wouldn't move, not an inch. At that altitude, the line between hero and victim is razor thin. Stay too long, and you both become names on a memorial wall. Palchen Tamang knew the death zone better than most. He'd seen what happens to climbers who wait too long, bodies frozen in place, still clipped to the rope, eyes wide open in permanent disbelief. But now, for the first time, he wasn't walking past one. He was standing next to one, and he wasn't sure he'd be able to walk away. Every part of his training told him to descend, but his instincts, his pride, and his loyalty screamed to stay. Sherpas aren't just guides, they're lifelines. They're trained to lead, to protect, to shoulder the impossible, but even a lifeline can snap under pressure. The radio crackled again. Wind roared in his ears. His legs were shaking now, not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion. He'd been above 8,000 meters for too long. His oxygen tank was nearly empty. His backup mask had already frozen over. Breathing felt like choking. He looked at Subrata one last time, his client. The man who'd trained for years, who'd dreamed of this climb, who'd spent a lifetime chasing this one moment. And now, he was just sitting, refusing help, letting the mountain take him. Tamang tried to lift him. He got one arm over his shoulder, dragged him an inch or two, but Subrata's legs didn't move. He was dead weight, and Tamang could barely carry his own. He thought about his own family, his children back home, the other clients still relying on him further down the mountain, and something inside him broke. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final words, just a quiet understanding that the mountain had already decided. He unclipped his harness from Subrata's, adjusted the little oxygen he had left, and turned away. As he stepped back onto the ridge, something inside him shifted. Relief, maybe, or guilt, or both. Every step down felt like a betrayal, but also a return to life. Behind him, the wind swallowed everything. The descent was mechanical. Tamang wasn't thinking anymore. He was surviving. One foot, then the other. Every breath burned. Every step was a gamble. The trail blurred around him. The snow, the ropes, the ice, none of it looked real anymore. He passed other climbers, but barely registered their faces. Some nodded, some didn't even look. Up there, everyone is too deep in their own war to notice anyone else's. By the time Tamang reached Camp of 4, his face was frostbitten, his lips split, and his vision fading in and out. He collapsed outside the tent, barely able to speak. Other Sherpas rushed to help, pumped warm oxygen into his mask, rubbed life back into his hands. It took 2 full days for him to fully recover, just enough to explain what had happened. When the words finally came, they were quiet, heavy. He hadn't left Subrata behind out of coldness or carelessness. He had done everything he could, until he couldn't anymore. News of Subrata's death spread quickly. Some in the mountaineering world mourned him as another tragic loss in Everest's long, brutal history. Others questioned the choice. Could he have been dragged down? Could a rescue team have gone up? Should Tamang have stayed longer? But people who truly understand Everest knew the truth. Up there, survival isn't a choice. It's a calculation. And when one climber refuses to move, they're not just risking their own life, they're gambling with someone else's. Tamang had survived, but the cost was written all over his face. When word of Subrata's death reached the public, the reaction was instant and divided. Some called it a tragedy, others called it abandonment. Critics began comparing Tamang's decision to other high-profile rescues on Everest. Just a year earlier, JLJ Sherpa had made headlines after dragging a Malaysian climber down from the death zone, risking his own summit push to save a man who was barely alive. That story went viral. Gelye was hailed as a hero. So why couldn't the same be done for Subrata? But what most people didn't understand was context. Gelye's rescue happened at 8,500 meters. Subrata was near 8,800. Closer to the summit than any human body should be. And unlike the Malaysian climber, who was unconscious and pliable, Subrata was awake, but refusing to move. You can't drag someone who fights you. You can't rescue someone who won't cooperate. Still, the comparisons kept coming. Social media lit up with armchair critiques. Some said Tamang should have waited longer. Others asked why no one else went up, as if rescues on Everest were like calling 911. As if any of them had ever stood at that altitude, face frozen, lungs collapsing, watching a man die in front of them while knowing they were next. Tamang didn't respond to the backlash. He didn't post any statements. He didn't try to defend himself. Because on Everest, survival is its own burden. and explaining it to people who've never been there is almost impossible. The real question wasn't whether he did the right thing. It was whether there ever was a right thing to do. Mount Everest isn't just the highest point on Earth. It's a place where the rules we live by start to break down. Up there, the usual definitions of right and wrong don't apply. Ethics get warped by altitude. Morality bends under oxygen masks and frozen limbs. When people hear that a climber was left behind, it sounds cold, unforgivable. But on Everest, no one really rescues anyone. At that altitude, carrying another person, just 50 feet, can be enough to kill you. Even elite climbers can barely lift themselves. Every pound of gear feels like a boulder. Every decision is a calculation. Do I have enough oxygen to make it to camp? Will dragging him end with both of us frozen to death? This isn't a movie. No one's swooping in with ropes and hero speeches. Up there, help comes only if you can help yourself first. Even Sherpas, famous for their strength and loyalty, can only do so much when the air itself is trying to kill them. Taming's decision wasn't unique. In fact, Everest is littered with stories just like this one. Climbers left to sit down in the snow and never get back up. Some bodies are still there, frozen in place, pass by every season, known not by name, but by location. Green Boots, the German woman, the Canadian in red. What makes Tamang's story different is that he talked about it. He didn't cover it up. He didn't hide. He said the quiet part out loud. I was too tired to bring him down. And in the death zone, sometimes honesty is more brutal than silence. Palchen Tamang made it down the mountain. Subroda Ghosh didn't. And no matter how many times you replay the story, no version ends cleanly, because Everest doesn't deal in heroes or villains, just choices, harsh, unrelenting choices made in conditions most people will never understand. Up there, survival isn't just about strength, it's about timing, oxygen, weather, and sometimes impossible decisions. Was Tamang wrong for walking away? Or was he simply honest about what thousands of climbers already know but never say? That Everest doesn't forgive hesitation, and trying to save someone who won't move can mean you don't make it home either. Maybe the real question isn't what he should have done. Maybe the question is, what would you do? If rescue above 8,000 meters is almost impossible, is it ethical to sell guided trips to the top at all? Should Everest be capped, closed, or left to personal risk? Drop your take and defend it. If the summit stories sound brutal, they're only half the truth. Dawn, Chris, Roland, Weber, Subrata, they chose to step into the death zone for themselves. But far below them, another group walks into danger again and again, not for a dream, but for a paycheck. To understand what Everest really costs and who actually pays, you have to leave the ridge, climb down through the camps, and step into the most dangerous workplace on the mountain, the Khumbu Icefall. 6:45 a.m., a slab of ancient ice broke free above Everest's busiest lane. In seconds, a routine carry turned into the mountain's darkest morning, and 16 lives were gone. What shattered, why that route was crowded, and who warned about it years earlier isn't as simple as it sounds. To see why, you have to understand the trap they were walking into. The Khumbu Icefall looks like a frozen river, but it's alive. Blocks of blue ice lean, grind, and slide a few feet every day. Crevasses open overnight, towers tilt without a sound. To reach Camp 1, every team has to thread this moving maze before the sun softens it. Speed is safety here, but speed comes with blind spots. The route snakes through choke points guides call the popcorn and the narrow gate beneath the west shoulder. It's the highway everyone shares, clients, load carriers, and rope-fixing crews, because there isn't another practical way from base camp to the western Sidi-Bariem. Aluminum ladders span cracks that swallow houses. Ropes mark a line, not a guarantee. Seracs, blocky cliffs of ice, hang overhead like glass balconies. They don't warn you. They don't groan. They just let go. Cross early, move light, keep spacing, and you still gamble every second you're in that shadow. The longer you spend inside, the worse your odds. That morning, the season was young, camps needed stocking, and crews were making multiple trips through the same squeeze. The system required it. The icefall punished it. And on April 18th, the weakest link wasn't a ladder or a rope. It was the wall above the route itself. But the real trouble didn't start with a misstep. It started with what broke loose next. It wasn't a snowslide. It was a chunk of the mountain itself. A serac on the west shoulder let go, turning solid ice into a crushing wave. It fell straight into the narrowest part of the route, the place everyone had to pass. Crews were ferrying loads, oxygen, rope, tents, moving in a line with spacing as trained. There's no siren for this kind of hit. 1 second it's quiet, the next, the air is white and heavy and moving fast. Ladders twisted, anchors ripped. The trail vanished under blocks the size of trucks. Some workers were ahead of the impact and ran for higher ground. Others were in the dead center. Radios crackled, then went silent. In that slot, even a perfect reaction buys you only a few steps. By the time the ice settled, the icefall had rearranged itself. Crevasses widened. Debris filled the path. Visibility was damn near zero. Those who could move started digging with bare hands and shovels, calling names, marking spots, trying to keep the route from collapsing again under their feet. The clock turned brutal. Every minute inside meant more risk. Heat softens ice, and the shoulder above still looked unstable. Rescuers had to choose, search deeper, or get everyone who was still alive out before the next break. But the question no one could ignore was bigger than the collapse itself. Why were so many workers stacked in that choke point at the same time? When the noise faded, the icefall was a maze of fresh debris. People were buried in pockets, some only an arm showing, some gone under completely. The first survivors didn't wait. No one does. They clipped off the fixed line, dropped packs, and started digging with gloves, axes, whatever they had. Names were shouted, then numbers, then just voices. You can't organize a perfect rescue when the ground you're standing on is still shifting. Radios came alive in bursts. "I've got one! Need a shovel! Move! This whole section is sagging." A few were pulled out fast, stunned but breathing. Others were pinned under tangled ladders and smashed aluminum. The line of travel had turned into a catchment, and every step around it threatened to trigger another slide of blocks. Helicopters tried to help, but even that has limits. Pilots hovered at the edge, wind buffeting, waiting for brief windows. Sling loads went one way, the injured went the other. Ground teams marked where they heard knocking and where the ice was too unstable to touch. In the end, bodies were recovered where it was safe, and 3 never came home. Not because anyone gave up, because the mountain closed the door. By midday, the urgency shifted. Keep searching and risk more collapse, or pull back before the heat loosened everything again. That choice wasn't abstract, it was survival math in real time. The day ended with exhaustion, silence, and a question none of them could shake. Why did this many people have to stand in this kill zone at once? And that leads to the part most viewers never see, the system that put them there, again and again. Because that's the job. Local crews move first, move most, and move heavy. Before clients ever touch a ladder, workers have already crossed the icefall again and again, hauling rope, oxygen, tents, fuel, food. Fixers set the line. Others shuttle loads to Camp 1 and Camp 2. It's a conveyor belt built on people. The math is harsh. Each carry means another spin through the most unstable section. Big teams mean big piles of gear. Early season means more trips in a short window, before the sun softens the ice and before winds shut the route. When the weather finally opens, everyone goes. So, lines stack, spacing shrinks, and risk multiplies. Pay is better than it used to be, but the exposure isn't shared equally. Clients might pass the icefall a handful of times. Workers can do dozens. They go at dawn to beat heat and traffic, often making 2 laps in a day if the schedule demands it. The safer choice, fewer crossings, lighter loads, doesn't always win against deadlines and pressure. There's a crew dedicated just to keeping that highway alive, the Icefall team that resets ladders and anchors after the glacier shifts. Even they can't outpace a falling wall. When a route hugs the west shoulder for speed, everyone spends more minutes beneath a hanging hazard. If that hazard lets go, anyone in the funnel is in play. So, yes, they were there because the mountain season requires it, but they were also there because of how the route had been set, how the calendar compresses decisions, and how profit and prestige move the line. And the thing is, people had raised the alarm about that very section before. This wasn't a bolt from the blue. Guides had flagged that overhanging bulge years earlier. In 2012, one of the biggest operators shut down his entire season, pointing straight at the west shoulder and calling it a loaded gun. Others grumbled but kept moving. The route still crept closer to the wall because it was faster and felt cleaner than weaving through the center. Teams talked about early and fast like it was a shield. Cross before heat, keep the line tight, shave minutes where you can. But minutes add up when hundreds of trips stack under the same hazard. People on the ground knew it. You can hear it in their briefings. Move quiet, no bunching, eyes up. That's not paranoia. That's experience. There were also whispers about warmer spells and softer ice. Not every season, not every day, but enough to spook veterans. A few called for shifting the route back toward the middle of the glacier. Slower, more ladders, fewer seconds under that wall. The compromise never stuck. Speed sells, and the season clock never stops ticking. So, when the Serac finally let go, it didn't just break ice. It broke the illusion that you could out-strategy a cliff hanging over your head, which is why the reaction after the tragedy wasn't just grief, it was fury. Grief turned into a line in the snow. Crews gathered, spoke plainly, and said the season couldn't go on like nothing happened. Families needed real support, not token envelopes. Workers wanted higher insurance, medical coverage that actually covered, and a fund for those left behind. For once, the people who keep the mountain moving had leverage, and they used it. Expeditions stalled. Some leaders backed the workers, others looked for ways to keep climbing, then realized there was no route without the very teams in mourning. Tension rippled through base camp. Helicopters came and went. Flags went to half-staff. Meetings stretched late, and rumors moved faster than the glacier. The point wasn't drama. It was dignity. One by one, groups packed. Not because the summit was impossible that year, but because crossing the Icefall again felt like a betrayal. The message carried well beyond the mountain. The risk wasn't abstract, and the people carrying it had finally said enough. The standoff forced a new question onto every expedition plan. If the work that makes climbing possible isn't safe or fairly backed, does the climb still make sense? And for the first time, authorities and operators had to answer in public. Changes landed quickly on paper. Insurance minimums rose. Families received larger payouts. Officials promised a safer approach through the Icefall, pushing the line more toward the center to reduce exposure to the west shoulder. Training got more attention. Briefings stopped pretending the hazard was background noise. On the ground, the fixes were real but imperfect. A central route can be colder, more crevassed, more ladder-heavy. It slows everything. Slower means longer exposure, even if the overhead hazard is reduced. Some seasons brought the path back closer to the shoulder anyway, because the glacier never sits still. Safety on Monday could be a trap by Friday. Teams adapted. Smaller carries, stricter spacing, tighter turnaround times. More talk about when to wait and when to move. The Icefall doctors, the crew who build and maintain the route, earned broader respect and slightly stronger backing. Slightly, the job stayed brutal. The conversation shifted from, can we make it safe, to, what risks do we accept and who decides? And that's where the next round of arguments took root. Everest is sold as a personal victory, but it runs on shared risk. Members pay for a dream, workers pay with repetition. A client might pass the Icefall a handful of times. A load carrier might pass it dozens. One summit selfie hides 100 crossings that made it possible. Money complicates every choice. Faster routes please customers. Tighter schedules sell spots. but faster and tighter mean crowding, and crowding multiplies danger in the exact places that punish hesitation. The math isn't philosophical. It's bodies per minute under a hanging wall. Add in publicity. A big stunt gets headlines. A helicopter shortcut sparks debate about fairness and ethics. Every trick to make the mountain feel manageable has a cost somewhere else, usually paid by the people resetting ladders at dawn. And then there's the weather creep, the sense that warm spells are more common, that freeze-thaw cycles bite deeper. Maybe it's trend, maybe it's noise, but the Icefall doesn't care about hashtags. It cares about temperature and time. If the window narrows, pressure rises. When pressure rises, corners get tested, which loops us back to that morning. A single break exposed more than ice. It exposed the bargain everyone had been living with. 16 men left in the dark to make the mountain workable for everyone else. A wall of ice broke, and the route, the schedule, and the business model broke with it. The aftermath raised payouts, shifted lines, and changed speeches. It did not change the Icefall's nature. So here's the truth. Everest can be climbed with care, skill, and luck. But the Icefall remains a toll gate that charges by the minute. And some people still pay more of those minutes than others. If risk can't be erased, who gets to set the price? And when the glacier moves again, as it always does, who stands underneath it? From the death zone to the Icefall, the pattern doesn't change. The mountain is constant, and we're the variable. David Sharp, Green Boots, Scott Fischer, Don Cash, Christopher Kulish, Roland Yearwood, Thomas Weber, Subrata Ghosh, and the 16 men in the Icefall all entered the same quiet contract. Limited time, limited oxygen, unlimited ways for things to go wrong. Their stories aren't just about altitude, they're about the systems we build around a single peak. Permits sold, routes chosen, risks outsourced. Everest can't decide who lives and who stays. We do, long before anyone clips into a fixed line. The summit may be only a few footprints on a ridge, but the real mountain is made of every choice that leads there. The question isn't whether Everest is worth the price. It's knowing the bill, whose life we're willing to stake on paying it.